Future verb conjugation in Hebrew describes actions or events that will happen at some point in the future. The Hebrew future tense is mainly based on prefixes, with some suffixes, and its formation is actually the hardest to form because it varies by pattern. Still, it's quite similar to the past tense, in the sense that every conjugation is made by adding prefixes to verb roots based on person, gender, and number. This means that the Niqqud along every conjugation will change, depending on person, gender, and number. Unlike the present tense, the Hebrew future tense will have prefixes and some suffixes for every pronoun. However, unlike previous tenses that I showed in other videos, the future tense will have irregular verbs and conjugations, because grammatically, additional prefixes will highly affect verb root patterns. Because Hebrew is built on root pattern systems, which are typically regular, in the future tense, some roots will be unpredictable and thus irregular, and they will be shown at the end of the video. Considering the root system, we first need to see the prefixes that will be placed at the beginning of every conjugation for every pronoun, and then we can practice with some verbs. The prefix for ani, I, is in. The prefix for ata and at, you masculine and feminine, is t. But the conjugation for at, you feminine, will get a suffix in the end, which is e. In essence, it's the only conjugation in the future that will end in e, and its pronunciation will be with the root letter that ends the word. The prefix for who, he, is y. The prefix for he, she, is t. The prefix for anachnu, we, is n. The prefix for atem and aten, y'all masculine and feminine, is t. And both of the conjugations for the pronouns will get a suffix of u. It's the letter vav with the Niqqud shuruk, a dot in the left center of vav. So, this suffix is just the sound of u that will be with the root letter that ends the word. At last, the prefix for hem and hen, they masculine and feminine, is y, and these pronouns will also have a suffix of u. These are the prefixes and suffixes for future verb conjugations for every pronoun, and due to the complexity of the prefixes, the Niqqud within them will change depending on the verb. This means that you'll have to memorize future conjugations separately, because their patterns in the Niqqud may not be predictable. This is why the Hebrew future tense is the hardest, and why knowing the Niqqud is highly essential. Additionally, the pronouns ani, anachnu, atem aten, and hem hen are the only ones with no gender, which means that the conjugations for these pronouns will apply to both male and female speakers, while ata, at, hu, and he are gendered. This is the pattern for the beginning and end of verbs in the future tense in Hebrew, with some prefixes being borrowed. Now, we can practice with different verbs to see how the prefixes can change in the Niqqud. Let's conjugate the verb lichtov, to write. When conjugating lichtov in the future tense, we need to use its root pattern, which consists of chaf, taf, vet. Chaf, taf, vet. First, we put the prefixes that correspond to each pronoun. Then, add the root letters in the future pattern, then provide suffixes to some conjugations, and finally, apply the Niqqud. For the verb lichtov, the majority of the prefixes begins with the chirik, and they do so because the infinitive of lichtov begins with the chirik. Ani echtov. Ata tichtov. at tihtevi, with the suffix e that connects with the last root letter in the conjugation. Hu yichtov. He tichtov. Anachnu nichtov. Atem, aten, tichtevu, with the suffix u that connects with the last root letter in the conjugation. Hen yichtevu, also with the suffix u. As you can see, the pronouns ata, you masculine, and he, she, have the same conjugation, so they're simply borrowed, and context will tell the difference. Also, we can tell that most conjugations begin with the chirik, because of the infinitive of the verb that begins with the same vowel sound and symbol. In essence, knowing the vowel symbol in the infinitive can help us indicate how the prefixes in the verb will sound, along with other conjugations. So, the infinitive is very useful to know in the future tense conjugation, but remember that the pattern of the Niqqud is not predictable for the majority of verbs. While the formation of root letters may be similar in other verbs, the Niqqud in the prefixes may be different. So let's practice with a different verb to see how the prefixes can vary. Let's conjugate the verb lalechet. Lalechet, to go. The infinitive of the verb has the vowel sound and Niqqud symbol segol. Segol, which means that conjugations in this verb will have prefixes that begin with this symbol. But actually, the prefixes will begin with the tserei, which has the same vowel sound as segol. This is done grammatically to look better. Ani elech. Ata telech. At telchi. Hu yelech. He telech. Anachnu nelech. Atem aten telchu. Hen yelchu. This is how lalechet is conjugated in the future tense, starting every conjugation with the vowel sound e, because of the same vowel sound in the infinitive. Now, let's conjugate a different verb. Ledaber. Ledaber, to speak. The infinitive of the verb has the vowel sound and Niqqud symbol shva. Shva, which means that conjugations in this verb will have prefixes that begin with the same vowel sound and symbol. Ani adaber. Ata tedaber. At tedabri. Hu yidaber. He tedaber. Anachnu nedaber. Atem aten tedabru. Hen yidabru. Now, let's conjugate a reflexive verb, lehitrachetz, to wash oneself. Because reflexive verbs have the prefix hit in them, the future prefixes will be attached to the reflexive prefixes, so the conjugations will not differ from how regular verbs are conjugated. Also, the prefix hit in lehitrachetz begins with the chirik, so we can assume that conjugations of this verb will begin with the same vowel sound and symbol. Ani etrachetz. Ata titrachetz. At titrachzi. Hu yitrachetz. He titrachetz. Anachnu nitrachetz. Atem aten titrachatzu. Hen yitrachatzu. This is how reflexive verbs and verbs in general work in the future tense in Hebrew. The pattern of the letters may be predictable, but the prefixes may change the Niqqud, depending on which vowel sound and symbol starts an infinitive. After learning the Hebrew future tense, irregular verbs should be known, and such verbs can be irregular because of weak roots, contracted forms, and prefix changes. For instance, some future tense verb forms do not follow the standard prefix pattern, like the verb lavo. Lavo, to come, whose root is vet vav aleph. Vet vav aleph. This verb is irregular in the future because its root has vav and aleph, causing the standard prefix concept to shift, along with the Niqqud, like saying ani avo or hu yavo. A different irregular verb is latet, to give, whose root is nun taf nun, taf nun. It's irregular because the nun disappears in many forms, one of which is in the future tense, like saying ani eten or hu yiten. A different irregular verb is lasim, to put, whose root is sin vav mem sofit, It's irregular because it has an unusual root structure with weak roots, like saying ani asim or hu yasim. In summary, Hebrew has multiple irregular verbs in the future tense, and we can see from this chart the reasoning for why they may be irregular. I will not explain this concept too much because the previous verbs encompass the general understanding of irregular future verbs. What you're seeing are the specific reasons why verbs may be irregular, but focusing on them is not that necessary. Still, some other concepts should be known, like in modern Hebrew, modal constructions, want to, need to, can, etc. use the future tense of the modal verb plus an infinitive, like saying ani ertze lallechet. Ani ertze lallechet. I will want to go. Moreover, the future tense can be used with conjunctions, like im, meaning if, which is a concept I'll explain in the next video. When using conditional or time clauses, the future tense is used, even in the dependent clause, like im hu yavo, hu yir'eh et haseret. Im hu yavo, hu yir'eh et haseret. If he comes, he will see the movie. Unlike English, Hebrew uses the future tense in both parts of the sentence, whereas English uses the present. At last, some verbs in Hebrew may be semi-regular because they may start with weak roots and contain guttural letters. In such a manner, the structure of the verbs may be regular, but due to weak roots, they are semi-regular. In this example, you can see how the aleph at the start is not a prefix, it's part of the root. Overall, this is how the future tense fully works in Hebrew.